Good afternoon and welcome to The Disclosure Dilemma. My name is Carter Hammett and I am the Manager of Employment Programs at Epilepsy Toronto, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Since 2000, disability has remained the single leading cause of human rights complaints in every jurisdiction. 80% of these occur within the context of the workplace, and they will continue well into the future. As we continue to deal with an aging population, invisible and episodic disabilities will become even more prevalent than they are today. Progress has been made in trying to understand people who are aging and acquiring disabilities and want to continue working longer. However, disclosure remains one of the biggest issues facing this population. We've decided that this issue needs to be addressed. So we've assembled a panel of experts to help us understand this issue a little bit more. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our guests who for the next hour will share their experiences and expertise with you. Hopefully shedding some light on this controversial issue. Each guest will have several minutes to share some of their stories. This will be followed by a few questions from myself, and then we'll hopefully open the floor for questions from the audience. So without further ado, let's introduce our guests. So first up, we have Jessica DeMarinis. She is a staff lawyer at Arch Disability Law Center in Toronto, Ontario, and she practices human rights and disability rights law. Jessica joined Arch in August 2017. Prior to working at Arch, she practiced employment and human rights law in Hamilton, Ontario. Jessica has appeared before various courts and administrative tribunals, including the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and the Ontario Superior Court. Welcome, Jessica. Nice to have you here. Yeah. Our second panelist is an old and well-known friend of Epilepsy Toronto's. Her name is Shonette De Souza. She is a human resources specialist, diversity, inclusion, and invisible disabilities advocate. She is a certified human resources leader with over a decade of people and culture experience. She's currently a talent strategist at Powerhouse Talent, where she partners with organizations to develop their employer brand, consistently market their recruitment strategy, and attract the right talent. Besides her work in HR, she is a passionate advocate for diversity, inclusion, and invisible disabilities. She is a speaker, a writer, and a guest contributor to various online publications. Shonette is also an Epilepsy Toronto ambassador and a global epilepsy exchange, and is also part of the United Way Greater Toronto Speakers Bureau. Welcome, welcome, welcome back, Shonette.
Thank you.
And finally, our third guest is named Allison Silk. She is a young professional and graduate of Queen's University with diverse experience studying and working in accounting, data analysis, biology, mathematics, and statistics. Since she was diagnosed with epilepsy in 2017 and has faced numerous challenges in adapting to a life with this condition, including the pursuit of a career in finance and returning to school. She is currently a job seeker navigating the hiring process as a person with a disability for the first time. Concerned with tackling the big questions of when and how to disclose, she has been working closely with Epilepsy Toronto to develop a disclosure plan and prepare for career success in the quickly evolving modern workforce. She is excited to share her experience and learn from others to address the obstacles presented by disclosure of an invisible disability. So there you go. There's our panel for today. So everybody, I would love to welcome each and every one of you to this important discussion. And I'm hoping it is probably the number one issue that I, as an employment counselor, deal with on a regular basis. And it's a huge issue, not just for people living with epilepsy, but for a wide variety of people living with episodic and invisible conditions as well. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Jessica for the next few minutes, and she has a few things that she would like to share with our audience. So Jessica, it's all yours.
Sure. Well, thanks, Carter. Really happy to be here on this panel. So thank you to Epilepsy Toronto for inviting me. As Carter said, I am a staff lawyer at Arch Disability Law Center, and I thought I would start to just give a little bit more information about what Arch is and what it is that we do at my office. So we are a legal aid, partially are funded by legal aid, and we provide pro bono legal services across all of Ontario. We are mandated to provide, to advance the rights of persons with disabilities and address the systemic barriers that exist in our society for persons with disabilities. And then the way we do that, we take on a number of different kinds of services. One of those is called summary advice and referral service, where you, if you are someone with a disability who lives in Ontario, you can actually contact Arch and speak with a lawyer free for up to 30 minutes. And so that's obviously one of the ways that we connect with our communities and assist our communities with legal information and advice. But we also do take on, submissions to government about legislation. We do community development presentations. We do community development education about human rights and disability rights law. We take on law reform projects. And in some rare cases, we do actually do, I won't call them rare, we have a number of cases ongoing, but our resources are always very strapped, but we do our best to take on cases and represent where we are identifying a systemic barrier that we think can be addressed through litigation. And I will echo what Carter was saying, that this disclosure issue is something that we talk about and think about a lot. Our communities and our clients say the same things: how to disclose, when to disclose, how much to disclose, because the stigma and the difficulties with finding a safe place and a safe way to disclose it is really, really challenging. Some of our clients describe it as sort of this deciding when and how to disclose becomes a job in and of itself, especially when we're talking about in the context of the workplace. And we've had people describe it as sort of a spidey sense to decide when it's when and how it's a good way to disclose and whether that's going to be received in the way that you want and need. And so what we try to do with our clients and with our communities is go back to what we know. As Carter said, I'm a lawyer, so I try to give my clients the tools that come from the law and what we have in the Human Rights Code. And what the Human Rights Code says is that persons with disabilities in particular, have the right to be free from discrimination in a number of contexts, but I'll talk about employment today. So right to be free from discrimination or differential treatment on the basis of disability. And a piece of that right, which it remains inherent with you. That's why we love the Human Rights Code. It's what we call rights conferring legislation. So that right kind of exists with the person as they move about the world. So, or moving about Ontario, I should say. So the right to be free from discrimination, part of that right has this sort of corresponding duty on behalf of the employer to accommodate. And so under the Human Rights Code, your employer has the duty to accommodate you and your disability related needs so that you can meaningfully job search, access employment, perform in your role, and that right, and that the right to be free from discrimination and the corresponding duty to accommodate travels with you throughout your whole job search journey. So all the way, through training and access to pay and benefits, and then all the way through to termination, if that unfortunately happens. But there can be no, of course, termination that is linked to, or at least in part due to, disability. And I guess bringing it back to the disclosure, the reason why we're here, the reason why that's so important is because generally disclosure of disability is what triggers this duty to accommodate on behalf of the employer. So the employer then, it is incumbent on the employee, I should say, first to disclose, and then the employer then responds and says, how can we, or what do we need to do to have that conversation about what accommodations are appropriate. I think another really important piece is sort of how much to disclose. Now, the duty to accommodate and the job of the employer is really to take that request at face value in good faith, unless there is something particularly complicated, or maybe they have some questions about exactly what accommodations need to be put in place in the workplace. The employer is required to kind of say, or take what the employee offers. So maybe it's just, I have a disability and I need this accommodation. Take that at face value, and they don't need any more details. And so it's what we tell our clients is that in terms of how much to disclose, it's within definitely nothing with respect to diagnosis is necessary, but definitely limitations, abilities, any restrictions you have, all of that is good things to disclose. And I could go on all day, but I know I want to make sure I'm on time, Carter. So the thing I will end with for my opening discussions is another thing we say, because we know that the law is, looks good on paper, but how does that actually work in real life? Because we are dealing with the real life stigma, and so those sort of attitudinal barriers that are unspoken. The thing we say is it's really, while difficult, it can be helpful to ask for that accommodation as early as possible, so that if there are some difficulties that are associated with your lack of accommodation in your workplace, it prevents the employer from identifying those as performance issues. And then you have to have that unfortunate conversation where you're saying, well, actually it's not performance, it's the fact that I have some limitations and I need some accommodations in the workplace. But to put an employee on the best footing going in, it's always a good idea to start the conversation with those accommodations and with the disclosure, so that you don't give the employer the opportunity to kind of make assumptions or improperly assume that there's some performance issues happening. But with that, I will end my opening remarks, and I'll hand it over back to Carter. Thanks very much.
Okay, Jessica, thank you so much. That gets us off to a great start and opens up a lot of questions. So as previously mentioned, Shonette has a pretty long and distinguished career in human resources. And I know that she has dealt with a wide variety of industries and the issue of disclosure has come up several times, I'm sure, within a variety of contexts. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Shonette for her insights at the present.
Thank you, Carter. So for me, I guess I have a unique opportunity where I sort of sit on both sides of the table. So on the one hand, I have the experience in my professional background of being an HR leader. So really listening to employee stories about their own challenges, about their own issues with their own invisible disabilities or episodic disabilities, and really being that bridge between an employer and an employee. In my experience, over the time that I've actually worked in HR, employees have felt comfortable after a little while disclosing to me that they actually have a certain, whether it's a disability or a condition or a particular illness, but they might have challenges actually disclosing that to their superior, to their manager, for whatever reason, and that could be a whole other discussion or a whole other session. But for the purposes of this discussion, then we would have to take that as an HR leader. I would take that and sort of assess it with a balanced eye. So really assess what, like Jessica was talking about, what the legal side of things are. And certainly people like Jessica are a big value for us in the HR industry. And the human side of things. So that employee, that candidate is a person like anybody else. So we have to sort of balance the two sides. And that's where my HR expertise comes in, sort of sitting in the middle of those two. And on the other hand, I have the experience of actually being a person with an invisible disability or an episodic disability like epilepsy. And so I myself am sort of navigating my career through the workforce having this. And my journey with epilepsy began in 2012, if I remember correctly. It's been a while, but it's been challenging going through that time. But for me, it has actually emerged as a positive one. So, you know, I've had, as anyone with epilepsy or any condition can understand, been through a lot of doctor's appointments, going through several medications, hospital stays as well, eventually until you get your diagnosis. And through a lot of this time, I've certainly grown, whether it's, you know, personally, professionally, whatever that has looked like for me at different periods of my journey in the last little while. And eventually I've sort of taken on the mission to, so to speak, to spread the word about epilepsy, about awareness. And that's where I came across Epilepsy Toronto, and I've sort of worked with them as an epilepsy ambassador for a long time. And in really doing that and spreading that message, because I think it started with you guys, that where I actually had the platform to tell my story and be an ambassador. So that has really helped me sort of navigate this whole field of advocacy. And to me, what really started as a random occurrence now in 2012, April 4th, 2012, is what I can remember my first seizure being, has now really become my purpose. So while I'm in HR on the one hand, and I really deal with a lot of the issues from the HR side, I also experience the other side of things where I advocate for people with disabilities. And my goal in doing that is really twofold. So on the one hand, it's to educate and encourage employers to really see the value in hiring candidates that have epilepsy or any other invisible disabilities, episodic disabilities, or also in really welcoming the employees that they currently have that might disclose said condition and see them as a strength and not a weakness, because that's what I've sort of discovered about myself in the last little while. And on the other hand, for people who have any type of disability or condition, my goal is to really inspire them to speak up and talk about their disability, their condition, with a purpose to spread more awareness. Because really, I find with awareness, and in my case, it certainly helped, with education and awareness really came understanding of what it is we have to live with, and sort of see the bigger picture in things and how we can also add value into an organization. And I sit on both sides, so I can see sort of through a different lens what things look like. So that's really where I'm going into this discussion with. And yeah, I really thank you for having it. It's really going to be a good one.
Thank you, Carter. That's enlightening. Thank you so much, Shonette. Before we go any further, I would just like to remind our audience and encourage them to ask us questions. We'd really like to make this as interactive as possible, and because I know this is such an important issue for so many people, we really appreciate your participation. And so I would strongly encourage you to hit those buttons and submit your questions in the chat field, and we'll be happy to answer them. Okay, so so thank you again, Shonette. I really appreciate those comments. And now it's time for us to move on to our third guest. And Allison brings a slightly different perspective as a recent graduate and entrant into the field of employment. So Allison, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Allison. I'm excited to be part of today's discussion on disclosure with some guests who offer very interesting insights from their respective fields. I'm a client of Epilepsy Toronto. I've been working closely with their employment services team as I've been navigating my job search. I can't speak from an expert point of view, so my purpose here today is to speak to my story and my experience navigating working as a person with epilepsy and job searching and ultimately landing a job. So I was diagnosed with epilepsy in 2017 while I was employed. And at this point in time, it was a pretty large thing for me to deal with, not only personally understanding what it meant for me at that point in time and going forward, but how it impacted my professional life, namely that I lost my license. So it really impacted my commute. And it gave me no choice but to address it then and there because it had an impact on my working hours at that point in time. So when I was diagnosed, I did some quick research to understand my rights as a person with disability and what my employer's obligation was. But I will say, looking back at that time, I did not have the same tools and understanding that I do now to really be able to navigate the disclosure discussion to the best of my ability. So at the time, I went to HR, who helped me speak to my manager. All I disclosed was that I had a medical condition which did not allow me to drive anymore. And my manager was understanding and flexible around allowing me to change my hours to accommodate my transit schedule. So that experience was not negative. I wouldn't say it's particularly negative or positive either way. And in terms of managing my seizures in the workplace, I did not disclose that to my manager. I decided to disclose to a couple of close colleagues who provided support and who I could go to if I felt like a seizure was coming on and I just needed them to keep an eye on me, or go to them if I needed something. And for me, that ended up working well. So once that role ended, due to some restructuring, I found myself for the first time as a job seeker with a disability, and really having to understand what that meant. In addition to the stress of having to come up with a resume, cover letter, selling yourself in an interview, there's the challenge of navigating this process as a person with a disability. Experiencing seizures, there's something I have to live with. It's something that must be addressed. So I found that I really had to plan how to address this going forward in the workforce. So for me, education was a large component of this process. That's when I reached out to Epilepsy Toronto and their employment services, which helped cover a broad range of topics from resumes and interview prep, but also more specific topics for people with epilepsy, such as today's conversation. So the goal of doing this was to really understand what disclosure was and what I wanted to do about disclosing in the workplace. So I learned the pros and cons and learned the purpose of it is to connect myself to an accommodation, not to gain an unfair advantage. That was something I was really worried about, but understanding it more as leveling the playing field and allowing myself and my employer to benefit by me being able to perform my job to the best of my abilities. And a really important part of that process is communicating. So understanding myself and my seizures, my triggers, things like that is essential to be able to communicate my needs to an employer so that they can best accommodate me to their capabilities. So currently where I'm at, I applied to a number of jobs. I actually recently landed a job, which I begin next week. And I actually found this job through Epilepsy Toronto's employment services. And so this job actually is allocated for a person with a disability. And why I chose to go that route is because I wanted to enter my next employment opportunity based on a relationship of respect and trust and honesty with my employer. There's always some sort of risk because people are people, so you don't know how people may respond when you disclose. But I wanted to begin this dialogue on my own terms and work with a company who understands what it means to accommodate someone with a disability and with a culture of acceptance and strong diversity programs in place. So that was my decision. In the interview itself, the employer knew going in that I had a disability, but nothing about what it was, the diagnosis, anything like that. And they asked if I needed any accommodation at that point in time. And so I decided in the interview process, I said something along the lines of acknowledging that disclosure is an ongoing conversation with myself and my manager, and going forward, I'm happy to have that discussion to address how I can best be supported. So going forward, I'm pretty optimistic about the way that things are going and understanding the rights that we have that we're protected under the law as people with disabilities. But what it really comes down to is understanding myself and my needs, because that legislation is quite broad. And so to be able to really take advantage of it, I need to know how it applies to me specifically.
Oops.
And I'm finding that the more information I have, the more empowered I feel and the more comfortable I feel being, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
So the more comfortable I feel being upfront and,
okay.
Sorry?
Your bandwidth, I think, is a little bit low and the reception's a bit choppy. So you're kind of coming in and out, but
okay. Well, I've essentially reached the end of my blurb, so I think that's a good place.
Okay. Alice, so thank you very much. I don't know if it'd be possible for you to disconnect and then try reconnecting, if that potentially might help. And while we're doing that, I'd like to go back over to Jessica and start with some questions, if that's okay. And so from what I have seen and discussed with others, the law is, from what I've perceived, weakest at the hiring stage. And at protecting people from discrimination, it is so easy potentially for employers to disguise why someone isn't hired. It's impossible for Human Rights Tribunal to say that they were breached from the duty to accommodate. Do you agree with a statement like that?
I think there's a lot to that statement. I think if we're thinking from sort of a legal evidentiary perspective, proving discrimination at the hiring stage at a tribunal or before a court is very difficult. I would agree with that. I mean, I wish I had something more positive to say. I think
About
there's
reality.
some, it is challenging. I think one thing I was thinking of hoping to raise in the questions, in the question and answers, was some of the attributes of the AODA, or the Accessibility for Ontarians Act. And I don't think that that's a full answer, you know, or fix to that problem, but I do think that there are some interesting minimum standards that are set out in the AODA. Particularly with respect to the employment standard, and you know what employers are required to do for job ads, and I think while those are certainly, again, not a full answer, or they're certainly not fixing the problem, and it's not kind of all rosy, I think that those are certainly steps in the right direction into creating what those minimum requirements are, and creating an environment where people are encouraged to raise the fact that they may need an accommodation at some point in employment. And also, I think there's so much education that is required for employers through the AODA that I think it does address some of, or I'm hoping it does address some of those attitudinal barriers, and sort of, which come from, I'd like to think, not a place of being a bad person, just maybe from a place of not knowing, or being uncomfortable with how to navigate the situation from an employer's perspective. And so I think that there is, you know, some things we can look to in the AODA in that respect. And yeah, but to bring it back to your first comment, it is very challenging to prove discrimination in hiring. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. My next question is for Shonette. So as an employment counselor who also, by the way, lives with invisible and episodic disabilities himself, I am on both sides as well. So I appreciate that comment, and appreciate the dilemmas that people face. I've had to face that a couple of times on my own. But my question for you, one of the guidelines that I try to offer people as an employment counselor and is when to disclose. When is the best time? And I usually try and encourage people, job seekers, to disclose after their probationary period has been completed. I'm not sure if everybody would agree with that, and it also depends on a number of variables, including the type of disability and things like this. But I'm curious if I could get some feedback from you on that particular situation.
I think, I mean, that's a good point. You want to almost steer clear of that first few 3 to 6 months, whatever that is. And I mean, there's lots of layers to it. So with some people are able to sort of go out there and actually make that declaration or disclose fairly easily. But there's some people that perhaps need that job and they actually cannot go out there and disclose. So they might have to wait. What I would say is in a case where perhaps their job is really incumbent, or there are aspects of the job that have that might be affected, I should say, by the fact that you have a certain condition or certain symptoms because of a condition. In that case, I feel like you might have to have that conversation early on, because that could be a determinant of, okay, is this really, you know, the right role, or is this really, are there things we can do to alter this role in a certain way in order to for someone to perform to their best? Because sometimes from my experience, if if you do go through the first 3 to 6 months and pass the probation and then disclose it, the relationship kind of changes a little bit from an employer perspective, because often the thinking then is, well, you should have told me before, kind of idea, you know what I mean? But there's so many layers of why I wouldn't have said it before, or you know, why it's a very personal decision. Disclosure is a very personal decision, and one might disclose due to several reasons, right? For myself, I can speak of from a level of comfort. When I had my seizures, I was already in a job, much like Allison talked about. So I was already in there, and I'm just a very open person, so that might have helped a little bit. But I was just open and discussing, okay, well, because it had sort of sprung upon me as well, not only my employer. So it was a matter of actually, you know, making people around me aware. So it's almost like I feel if you disclose, and if you disclose early, you actually own the story more than your employer does. And you hold that power a little bit more than your employer does. And so I see it as an advantage. And often coming from an employer's perspective on the other side, I don't think all employers do it on a discriminatory basis. Like Jessica said, I think it comes from a place of not understanding what the symptoms are, what triggers people, not understanding enough about the conditions themselves. And that's where awareness comes in, that's where education comes in. And I feel like if more employers would actually understand it, because employees talk about it, unfortunately, we have to lead that discussion as an employee, which it's kind of an odd way to look at it, but you almost have to make them aware of the fact that, you know, this is something we need to have, and it needs to happen. So really, disclosure is very personal. What stage you do it as, it's really dependent on the job. It's dependent on your comfort level, and really how badly you need the job, or you need to keep the job, per se.
You know, to that list, I would add variables like how well do you understand the disability that you're living with?
Correct.
And how well you're able to articulate that, and
Yes.
also what kind of supports do you have in place within your personal space, and your environment as well. So I think those are some of the questions that kind of also need to be assessed prior to disclosure too. So yeah, those are really, really good points, Shonette. Thank you. Okay, Allison, I hope this doesn't sound like too much of an obvious question, and I'd kind of like to keep this one brief if we could, because I'd like to, I'm aware of the time, and I'd like to open the floor to audience members as well, who I'm sure have several questions, and we have some in the queue. But the one question I'd really like to hear from you, Allison, is why do you think in general, you've had some very positive experiences, and Shonette has too. Why do you think though that people would be generally so reluctant to disclose?
Okay. I think one point that I've touched on, and that Shonette touched on as well, is if you don't understand your disability itself, or if you stigmatize it yourself, it's really difficult to communicate that to someone else and feel like they might accept it if you can't do that yourself. I think people might automatically assume the worst, that if you're disclosing to someone, they'll automatically cast judgment or think less of you, or think you're getting an unfair advantage if you're asking for accommodation. Whereas more often than not, and particularly in today's environment, when employers are becoming more and more informed about how to manage people with disabilities in the workplace, I think there might be that assumption that that discussion might not go well. And if you don't have the resources to know how to approach that discussion, knowing what you're asking for or what you want to communicate, to have that dialogue. It can be intimidating, and you might feel like, okay, it's just easier to pretend that this isn't a thing, that I'm going to deal with it and keep it more as a secret rather than empowering yourself and recognizing it as part of you, not all of you.
That's great. Thank you so much. All right. I want to turn the floor, with the remaining time that we have, I'd like to turn the floor over to the audience for some questions. And as our guests have been speaking, a few have come in. So I'm just going to direct these to everybody as they come in. So I've got a comment from one audience member who suggests that it may be easier to acquire a job with a larger organization that is disability friendly. And he suggests that that's going to be because they've had the time and the infrastructure to put employment equity protection in place. So Shonette, I'd like to direct that question to you.
I think that's a good point. And that's certainly a lot of industries that have the capacity to build those programs and have done that. And I think a lot of companies, like the person who asked the question said, generally larger corporations tend to have more capacity to build these programs, more understanding, more research behind them. And so, and they're appealing to a larger employee base. So they will put programs in place that might be a bit more friendly to people who have episodic disabilities or any kind of disabilities in general. I think that organizations that are smaller, and I've been part of both, so organizations that are smaller might, in quote unquote, not want to deal with that situation, a particular situation or a certain case, because they have to invest so much of resources into particularly maybe that case or just a program in general. So they generally function on, you know, we have the capacity to just do what is required, perhaps legally, for example, the AODA, but not go that extra mile to go, okay, well, how can we be more welcoming perhaps to and inclusive to people of all abilities. And so I think that's very true. There's organizations that are larger that, again, like if you talk about flexibility is a huge one. And in COVID times, I mean, a lot of organizations are realizing that a flexible workplace is a good workplace. And so I think it's changing. It's changing, especially with the big organizations leading it. And I think a lot of them are going to follow, especially with generational change too. I mean, there's so many layers to this. This could be a discussion for hours.
Well, maybe we'll have to do a sequel then.
Yeah.
All right. Do you, just apropos what some of your comments, and very quickly, do you find that some industries are more disclosure friendly than others in your experience?
In most of the industries that I've been in, so I've sort of gone through real estate, retail. It really depends on, there's the generational sort of, as the older generation with the more traditional workplace culture sort of starts to move out of the workforce and newer generations come in, I think there is more understanding because with that comes newer workplace, you know, policies that are put in place, and they're more flexible. There's someone's career becomes more multifaceted, perhaps with the newer generations coming in. So I think it has a lot to do with certain industries. I find perhaps like a big corporation, like we said. So bigger organizations that are more corporate 9 to 5 sort of environment that are a bit more friendly or capable and have the capacity to perhaps provide a more flexible environment to their employees. So, maybe you can pick your hours and change those, like Allison talked about before. But certain industries, perhaps I'm trying to think of, that require a bit more strenuous, perhaps shift work that is very, very rigid, and you have to work certain hours, you have to work a particular job, that this probably a production line that this runs only from, this line runs only from X hour to Y, and you got to fit within that. Then unfortunately, it's not going to work, right, in those situations. So I think it depends on one, it also depends on what industry it is, what type of job it is, but that certainly makes a difference.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we have another question from the audience, and this one says, when preparing to return to work and disclosed, who is approached first, the HR department or your prospective manager? And if you've been off work for any length of time, when your role has been filled by somebody else, how do you determine who your manager is? How do you know when to begin the process of initiating discussions with your employer and returning to work? It's a little bit larger question than disclosure, but
Yeah.
but maybe Shonette, that might be a question for you. What do you think?
Well, I think it depends on, again, several factors. Depends on if you're going into a role. For example, if you're going in from the recruitment front, for larger companies, chances are you will be speaking with HR initially. But perhaps in smaller companies where perhaps they don't have an HR department, you might actually, a manager might be an actual person who's actually recruiting you. So it really depends on who's that first touch point for you when you're actually going into a new job, whether it's returning to work or joining the workforce. When you are already in a job, it really depends on the comfort level of your relationship with your manager. So if you have a great relationship and an open communication relationship with your manager, it's a lot of employees, some employees will go to their managers. Like, I mean, I can speak for myself. When, my manager was the first person to know, besides the fact that I was actually HR, so that didn't help. But in that case, I felt comfortable doing that. So it really depends on your comfort level with your manager at that point in your employment.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a couple more questions, and it's amazing how fast the time is flying here. So I'd really like to I'd like to squeeze in maybe 2 more if we can, depending on, and again, it's very clear that with the complexity and the layers of this issue, it's just, we're really just kind of scratching the surface. But, so I have one question that asks, is there a risk of not disclosing, especially if the disability is invisible? So perhaps Jessica might be able to answer that one.
Sure. I think the risk being, if there are accommodations needed in order to perform your best in the workplace, I think the risk being that you don't have those supports in place, and the employer making assumptions about performance. I think that's one risk, because it is, as I sort of alluded to in my first comments, that it is, it is challenging to have that be, or an accommodation or a request for accommodation be a response to what an employer is assuming is a performance issue. And then if we, that relationship then, and if I know trust and sort of comfort level has come up a few times in this conversation, and that it is so important, and so not a real legal principle, but that is such a human element that's so important to that relationship. And so I think that, if you I think a risk is that trust, there's some damage to that trust, even though you had good faith reasons for maybe withholding the fact that you needed some supports in the workplace or accommodations in the workplace. I think that there's risk that it's perceived by the employer in the wrong way.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I have one question that's here. I'm going to direct it to everybody. And the person asking the question says, I was open with my previous employer from the beginning about my epilepsy, and they were understanding initially. I was open with them about my surgery and the limitations that I had following surgery. My limitations are minor, but they were unable to accommodate me. I suspect if I had not told them about my surgery and limitations, I might still be working there. This experience makes it challenging for me to trust future employers. So how should I communicate it with my future employer? Maybe we could start with Jessica on that one. Oh, you're
Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you for sharing your comments. It is a horrible experience to have, and I completely understand where you're coming from with having some hesitations going forward. And that your previous employer wasn't someone who had the tools to be able to deal with, to navigate that situation appropriately. I do agree with everyone that there are so many layers and so many things to say. I want to talk about the limits to the duty to accommodate and how that varies for different employers. I think maybe a strategy that could be used going forwards is structuring your request for accommodation about, maybe reframing so that the request is the supports you need in order to do your job and fully perform your job. And not saying that you framed it in the wrong way, but maybe there was a framing issue where that being upfront about what the limitations were, maybe that, was sort of the priming, that's what the employer kept in their head. That's just my suggestion. I don't know. Would love to hear from the panelists.
Okay, I'm going to actually ask one more question.
Sure.
Because we have like 1 minute left. So this is going to be, I hope that we can possibly frame this in a positive way. And the question is, what do you think that we can do to encourage, what do you think we can do to encourage employers to cultivate disclosure positive environments? Shonette, I'd like to throw that one your way.
Okay.
And I'd like to hopefully hear from everybody really quickly. Even one suggestion each would be great.
So I think it really comes down to communication. Mm-hmm. So as an employer, just keeping the lines of communication honest, helping your employees, I guess, and what'll bring them their whole selves to work and not just certain parts of them, will be, I guess, if you keep those lines of communication open. And I think every manager should be encouraged to do that, not just from an HR perspective. I think every manager should be given the tools to in leadership, I suppose, on all levels. And I think part of which, in this case, to understand the humanity behind an episodic disability, I think EQ levels are important. So really having empathy for someone who is coming from that side of things in order to disclose, I think that will start to help people see that they're more welcomed into the organization, they're more part of it. So I really talk about a lot of the times about 3 A's. So awareness is big for employers. So really, the more you make employers aware, the more they are aware, the more they understand, the more they actually see the human behind the disability, like Epilepsy Toronto has the See the Person hashtag, and which is so important and it's so meaningful. Then it comes down to the second one is accommodation. So sometimes accommodation is something very simple as just adjusting lighting, or something as simple as perhaps, you know, giving that person the odd day where they might need to rest after that seizure, or you know, something as simple as perhaps giving them some time off to go to a doctor's appointment. So there's different levels of accommodation, and really, I think it comes down to just an employer being willing to be educated, I guess, to educate themselves in a lot of cases, perhaps. And then a lot of cases and a lot of times you'll see that will lead to employees that feel more welcomed, that will then become perhaps, you know, your greatest ambassadors, if that's what organizations are really looking for, because you want them to really go out and speak for you and your brand. So I think open communication is number one.
Great, thank you. Allison, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, what I would think is that approaching those types of conversations, to come in not as demanding, but rather as framing it as a discussion, and acknowledging that there's a responsibility on both parties, not just saying to your employer, I need this from you, but acknowledging that the person coming forward has a responsibility to communicate clearly what they are asking for, and that it's really a mutually beneficial arrangement to have an accommodation in place, and that many accommodations are not expensive or difficult to implement. And just make sure that you emphasize your strengths rather than your weaknesses coming into that conversation. And again, just coming in saying, this is part of me, not all of me, and really trying to destigmatize that on your behalf and on behalf of the employer.
Yeah, it's really about owning your narrative, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. And Jessica, the last word is yours.
Well, I don't advise employers, but if I did, I think I would say just to make accommodation conversations as normal as like requesting time off. You know, I think that there is, you introduce someone to the workplace and you say, you know, here's who you talk to for vacation requests, and here's who you talk to for accommodation requests, and here's what you do for this, and here's what you do for this. And then I think it's just that starts off on a foot that says that's part of our workplace, and we're happy to have those conversations. And I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, and it really communicates a strong message of diversity and inclusiveness and pluralism as well. So
absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, this has probably been one of the fastest hours I think I've experienced in a long time. This is clearly a very dynamic and multi-layered topic, and we've really only scratched the surface, and I'm sorry we didn't have a little bit more time to be able to explore some of this topic a little bit more in depth, but we've certainly opened up, and I think this discussion has certainly given people something to think about and to take home with them. So I'd really like to thank everybody for tuning in. I especially want to thank our communications team who was able to make this broadcast possible, Mackenzie Muldoon and Jacqueline. And definitely, I would really like to thank our panel for sharing their insights and their expertise with us. Shonette, Jessica, Allison, thank you all very much. And thank you all for tuning in. So one little reminder, if anybody is listening to this, I'd like to remind you to call 1-866-EPILEPSY, and that is a centralized number that will connect you to your nearest epilepsy chapter if you're looking for some kind of support. So with that, We come to the end of our discussion about the disclosure dilemma. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thanks again for everybody's contributions. Take care. We'll see you next time.